Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about films rather than books, and I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favourite horror films of the 1980s, the raddest decade for horror, and probably my favourite decade for horror as well. I think the 70s comes a close second, but yeah, the 80s, there was just so much creativity going on during that era, and yeah, some absolutely amazing horror films were created during that time. So as always, these are my favourites. They're not necessarily the best or what I consider the best, although I do think some of them would fit in both lists. And as usual, it was quite difficult to put this list together and narrow it down to just 10, but I did manage it and I'm pretty happy with the list. I think once I'd got it together and looking over it, they're all pretty well-known films. You know, there's nothing here that you won't have heard of before, but I really wanted to talk about them anyway. And I do want to do some videos in future about some lesser known titles, some underrated horror films, etc. So yeah, those are coming at some point in the future. But yeah, today I'm just going to focus on my favourites of the 80s. And also, as always, I haven't ranked these in any kind of order, so I'm just going to talk about them in chronological order of when they were released. First up, from 1982, is Poltergeist, directed by Tobe Hooper. This is about a family who move into a new home, and the young daughter starts to experience some strange and supernatural goings on, and the family get in a team of like paranormal investigators. And yeah, it's just such a brilliant film. It's a really great mix of the kind of like the Spielberg elements, the kind of magical type feeling to some of it. It does get dark as well and gruesome. Like, one of my favourite scenes probably of all time is the meat on the counter and then the dude in the mirror. Amazing. And next up, also from 1982, is The Thing, directed by John Carpenter. This is about a group of scientists undertaking some research in Antarctica, and this is just a body horror classic. The effects in here are utterly amazing, and the film is atmospheric and tense, and it's just an all-around wonderful movie watching experience. Also, who doesn't love Kurt Russell? I know I do. Next, from 1983, is Videodrome, directed by David Cronenberg. One of my favourite directors and one of my favourite horror films of all time. This is another body horror classic. This is about a man who runs a cable TV station and stumbles upon this strange broadcast involving sex and violence, and the story goes from there. It's weird and gross and awesome, and I think super unique. If for some reason you haven't seen the film, you've probably at least seen some of the iconic images from it, and yeah, this is just a hands down amazing film, one of my favourites ever. Next up, from 1984, is A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven. This is one of the most famous slasher movies and the first of one of the most famous movie franchises in horror. It is about a group of teenagers who are being stalked and killed in their dreams. Freddy Krueger is such a sinister character, at least in the first one. Yeah, such a great time. I think this one never gets old. It's just really, really creative and really, really well done. Yeah, I have a ton of love for this one. And next is from 1985. If you hadn't already guessed it from my t-shirt, it is The Return of the Living Dead, directed by Dan O'Bannon. This is about a strange gas that is unwittingly unleashed and there are zombies. This is a horror comedy and it is an absolute ton of fun. It is just hugely entertaining. It has some great gore and effects, It's got an absolutely brilliant soundtrack. It's got a striptease in a graveyard. What more could you want? Okay, next up from 1986 is The Fly, directed by David Cronenberg. Again, of course, he had to have more than one entry on this list. And this is, yeah, guess what? It's another body horror classic. And this is about a scientist who is trying to create a teleportation device, and he puts himself through it to test it, not realising that there is a fly in there with him, and he and the fly slowly morph into one. The effects are absolutely bonkers, amazing, and super gross and awesome. And it's also like super emotional as well. Like, I'm about to cry actually just thinking about it. Yeah, this film makes me sob. Yeah, this one is just a really fantastic horror film. Next, from 1987, is Hellraiser, directed by Clive Barker. This is about a man who is always looking for the next high, and especially of the sexual nature, and he comes into possession of a puzzle box which unleashes these demons called Cenobites, and yeah, we're then following the aftermath of that happening. And yeah, this is another really gory one, absolutely brilliant effects, and it's just really dark and grimy and gritty and really unique. Again, like, I feel like most of these films in this list really had their own unique thing going on, which is much harder to do nowadays, that, you know, everything's been done before. But yeah, this was a time when there was just a ton of creativity and new ideas. Another one from 1987 is The Monster Squad, directed by Fred Dekker. This is a kids movie that isn't a kids movie. It is a little bit like The Goonies in that we're following this group of kids in a small town on some kind of adventure, but this is a bit of a darker adventure. It's a lot more adult in tone and humour, and a lot of it went over my head when I first watched it. It has a ton of brilliant one-liners, super quotable. This is another one that also makes me cry. So yeah, I think it has a lot of heart. It's really emotional, but it's also, yeah, just an absolute ton of fun. And another one from 1987 is Prince of Darkness, directed by John Carpenter. Another entry for him on this list. This is about a priest who is brought into this old church, and he finds this strange green liquid, and of course there's something evil brewing. I think it's a great story. It has some really awesome visuals, it's really atmospheric, and it's got Alice Cooper in it as well. So yeah, just all around awesome. This is another one that has just like a kind of a dark, gritty tone to it that I really like, and of course a great Carpenter score. Yeah, this one doesn't seem to be one of Carpenter's films that gets talked about nearly as much as some of his other ones, but it's definitely one that I really love. Okay, and last but not least, from 1989 is The Burbs, directed by Joe Dante. I know this is more comedy than horror, but I think there are enough horror elements here for it to still count. It was definitely one of the films that I saw at quite a young age, and it was those horror elements that, you know, helped grow my love for horror in general, so it totally fits for my top 10 at least. This is about a group of neighbours who live in a cul-de-sac, and there is a new family that move into one particularly creepy house on the block, and the neighbour, Ray, played by Tom Hanks, is quite suspicious of them and starts to suspect them of sinister goings on. This is another one that has a ton of great one-liners. It's super quotable, and personally I think it's absolutely hilarious. And I love this film so much that I dressed up as Walter from the dream sequence for Halloween a couple of years ago. Yeah, which was a ton of fun. Nobody knew who I was. it's fine. But I really enjoyed putting that costume together. So yeah, ending this list on a light note, but I think there's a good mix of the darker stuff as well as the more lighter, humorous stuff in there, and I love them all so very much. These are all films that I saw either as a kid or as a teenager as I was getting into horror. They are all ones that had a big impact on me at that point, and yeah, grew my love of the genre and made me want to seek out more. You know, obviously these are all pretty well-known titles, so that's probably why I was able to watch them, you know, either rent them or watch them when they aired on TV. So yeah, these were ones that I had access to back in the day and were ones that I loved at that point, have rewatched over the years, and they have become favourites of mine. I guess that's how it works, right? So yeah, let me know if you also love any of these films on this list. Let me know what your favourites are of the 1980s. I would love to hear about that. Like I say, it was really difficult to narrow it down to just 10, so of course there are an absolute ton of other films from this decade that I love, but yeah, they didn't quite make the cut, unfortunately. Gotta be brutal sometimes. So that is it for now. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!